The courtroom smelled like floor wax and recycled air. Multnomah County Courthouse, room 14, third floor. I had been in this building before twice in 31 years of contract work, once for a deposition in 2009 and once last October when Robert Hayes filed the amended estate documents. David didn't know about the October visit. He was standing at the plaintiff's table now, 17 feet away from me, holding a check made out to his name for $5 million. I watched him touch the upper right corner of it, then the lower left, then the upper right again, 4 times in 90 seconds. His hand wasn't steady. Sarah was seated directly behind him in the gallery's first row. She had leaned forward twice in the last 3 minutes and said something near his ear both times. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. I'd been reading the geometry of that marriage for 8 months, the angle of her chin when she wanted something, the particular stillness that came over David's shoulders when he'd already made a decision he hadn't admitted to yet. His shoulders were very still now. There were 22 people in that room. I counted them the way I used to count personnel in a staging area quickly, without moving my head. 2 court clerks near the bailiff's station, 3 attorneys from an adjacent proceeding who'd stayed when they realized something was happening. Robert Hayes at the table to my left, writing something in the margin of a yellow legal pad. He had a slight curve at one corner of his mouth that I recognized. It was not a smile yet. It was the expression of a man who has done the preparation and is now simply watching the clock run down. Judge Patricia Chen entered at 10:04. She paused at the threshold of the bench 1 full second, maybe 2, and her eyes moved across the room in a single sweep. They stopped on me for exactly 1 second, then she sat down. I looked back at the documents on the table in front of me. The pages were already signed. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. David tore the check at 10:07, clean down the middle. Then again. The sound was very small in that room. I said nothing. I want to tell you how we got here. 8 years ago, David was 20 years old and had just received his acceptance letter to Lewis and Clark Law School. He called me from the campus library. I could hear the echo of the high ceilings in his voice, and he said, "Dad, I got in." That was all. I told him I'd drive over. He said I didn't have to. I drove over anyway. We went to a place on Burnside called Coava, a coffee shop that had been converted from an old warehouse. The ceilings were 30 feet high, and the light came in through industrial windows along the north wall. David ordered a black coffee because he'd seen me order black coffee his entire life. He sat across from me at a wooden table that still had the grain of the original floor planks running through it. And he looked the way young men look when they've just cleared the first real hurdle of their lives. Not triumphant, exactly, but relieved in a way that hasn't yet settled into confidence. His hands were wrapped around the cup. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he'd worn through his last 2 years of high school. I told him what I believed. I said money doesn't define you. Your actions define you. The choices you make when no one is watching, those are the ones that build the actual structure of who you are. Everything else is decoration. David looked at me over his coffee cup. He was 20 years old, and he had his mother's eyes, which were gray-green and very direct. He said, "I know, Dad," and I believed him. I checked my watch when we left. We'd talked for an hour and 12 minutes. I noted that the way I noted distances not for sentiment, but because precision is a habit that doesn't turn off. I drove home on the Burnside Bridge, and the light on the Willamette was flat and silver, and I thought I taught him about honor. Whether it holds is up to him now. That night, I called Robert Hayes about a property matter that had been sitting on my desk for 3 weeks. I signed the document he'd prepared, dated it, and filed it. I had been meaning to do it for a month. I did it that night. He called me from the campus library. I could hear the echo of the high ceilings in his voice, and he said, "Dad, I got in." That was all. I told him I'd drive over. He said I didn't have to. I drove over anyway. We went to a place on Burnside called Coava, a coffee shop that had been converted from an old warehouse. The ceilings were 30 feet high, and the light came in through industrial windows along the north wall. David ordered a black coffee because he'd seen me order black coffee his entire life. He sat across from me at a wooden table that still had the grain of the original floor planks running through it, and he looked the way young men look when they've just cleared the first real hurdle of their lives, not triumphant, exactly, but relieved in a way that hasn't yet settled into confidence. His hands were wrapped around the cup. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he'd worn through his last 2 years of high school. I had been thinking on the drive over about what to say to him. I was 51 years old. I had served 26 years in the Marine Corps, most of the last decade managing logistics and procurement contracts that ran into 9 figures. I had watched good men make decisions that destroyed them not because they lacked intelligence, but because they had decided somewhere along the way that what they could acquire was more important than what they could be trusted with. I had watched that particular confusion ruin careers, marriages, and in 2 cases I knew of personally, lives. So I told him what I believed. I said, money doesn't define you. Your actions define you. The choices you make when no one is watching, when there's no applause and no audience and nothing to gain from doing the right thing, those are the ones that build the actual structure of who you are. Everything else is decoration. David looked at me over his coffee cup. He was 20 years old, and he had his mother's eyes, which were gray-green and very direct. He said, I know, Dad. And the thing was, I believed him. I had raised him in a house where those words weren't a speech, they were the operating principle. His mother had lived that way until the morning she died, and I had tried to continue it after her. I thought it had taken root. He nodded. I drank my coffee. We talked for another hour about the law school curriculum, about the apartment he was looking for, about whether he should buy a used car or take the bus. When we left, he hugged me in the parking lot, a real hug, the kind where you feel the weight of the other person's arms. I drove home on the Burnside Bridge, and the light on the Willamette was flat and silver, and I thought I taught him about honor. Whether it holds is up to him now. For the next 4 years, I watched it hold. He called on Sundays. He came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and the occasional random weekend when he wanted a meal that wasn't from a delivery app. He was serious about his studies in the way that serious students are not frantic, but consistent. He had friends I met once or twice, people who seemed decent and moderately ambitious in the way that law students tend to be. I went to his moot court competition in his 2nd year and watched him argue a contract dispute with the kind of calm precision that I recognized as something he had not learned in a classroom. He lost on a technical point, but the judge on the panel, a retired federal magistrate named Colton, a man with 40 years on the bench, stopped him afterward and said, "You have good instincts. Don't let anyone talk you out of them." I thought about that later. I thought about it more than once. 4 years ago, David brought Sarah home for the first time. She came from a family in Lake Oswego, the kind of family that has a lake house and refers to it simply as the property. Her father was an investment manager. Her mother sat on 2 nonprofit boards and wore that fact lightly in the way that people do when it has always been true. Sarah herself was 25, sharp-featured, and possessed of a quality I had observed before in people raised with significant money, a constant, nearly imperceptible audit of the people around her. Not rude, not obvious, just measuring. She shook my hand at the door and looked me over once, quickly, the way you look at a room when you first walk in to assess whether it meets expectations. I was wearing the canvas jacket I'd had for 12 years. Sarah's eyes stopped on the jacket for 1 second. Then she smiled and said it was nice to meet me. Over dinner, she asked questions, good ones, offhand, as if the answers didn't particularly matter. What I had done in the Marines? What I did now? What kind of investments? I told her the kind that didn't require an office. At one point, David said, "My dad built the trust himself, him and my mom, before she died." He said it the way he used to say things about me when he was proud of them, without thinking about whether pride was the right word. Sarah looked at him when he said it, and for a moment, a single, unguarded moment, something moved across her face that was not calculation. It was closer to recognition, the kind you feel when you hear something that reminds you of a version of yourself you have decided not to be. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then she looked back at her plate. I noticed it. I did not think much of it at the time. Later, going through the transcripts with Robert, I thought about it more. There had been a moment when she could have gone a different direction. I believe that. I do not think it changes what she chose, but I believe the moment existed. After dinner, when David walked her to her car, I stood at the kitchen window and watched them in the driveway. Sarah was talking. David was nodding. At one point, she glanced back at the house, and even at that distance, I could read the expression. It was not hostile. It was simply evaluative, the way you look at a property you're trying to price. She had made her decision. Whatever the 2 seconds in the kitchen had been, they were finished. I was wearing the canvas jacket I'd had for 12 years. I had bought it at an Army surplus store in Pendleton in the winter after Ellen died, when I wasn't paying much attention to what I was buying and only needed something warm. It had been restitched twice along the left shoulder seam. The color had faded from olive to something closer to gray. It was the most comfortable piece of clothing I owned. Sarah's eyes stopped on the jacket for 1 second. Then she smiled and said it was nice to meet me. Over dinner, she started asking questions. She was good at it. The questions came in the middle of other conversation, almost offhand, as if the answers didn't particularly matter. She asked what I had done in the Marines. I told her logistics and procurement. She asked if I missed it. I said I missed the structure. She asked what I did now, and I told her I consulted occasionally and managed some investments. She asked what kind. I said the kind that didn't require an office. She looked at the kitchen, the appliances that were 15 years old, the linoleum floor I had been meaning to replace for 3 years, the window above the sink that had a hairline crack in the lower right pane. She looked at all of it in the same way she had looked at my jacket. After dinner, when David walked her to her car, I stood at the kitchen window and watched them in the driveway. I could see their faces in the glow from the porch light. Sarah was talking. David was nodding. At one point, she glanced back at the house, and even at that distance, I could read the expression. It was not hostile. It was simply evaluative, the way you look at a property you're trying to price. The next time David called on Sunday, he asked me how much money I had. I was standing at the kitchen counter with the same cold coffee I hadn't finished from breakfast. I set the cup down. The question itself was not what changed something between us. It was the way he asked it. Not curious, not concerned, careful, in the way that people are careful when they have been briefed on what to ask. I told him enough to live on, enough to take care of what needs taking care of. He asked if I had investments. I said yes. He asked if they were significant. I told him that significant was a relative word, and that I had always found it more useful to measure things by what they allowed me to do rather than what they added up to on paper. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sarah's family thinks it's strange that you live the way you do." I told him I understood that. I told him that different families had different ideas about what a good life looked like, and that I had arrived at mine over a long time and with some care. He didn't call the following Sunday. He called the one after that, and the conversation was shorter. 2 years ago, David married Sarah at a venue in the West Hills, a renovated estate that cost more per hour than most people made in a month. I wore a dark suit, bought for Ellen's funeral, and dry cleaned twice since. I sat in the third row on the groom's side, between a cousin of David's mother I hadn't seen in 11 years, and an empty seat no one claimed. David looked genuinely happy. I want to be precise about that, not performed happy. Whatever else was happening around him, he was not a man who had been forced into something. I held on to that because it mattered. Sarah came by the table once, briefly, to thank me for coming. She said it with warmth that was entirely correct and entirely surface level. Across the room, David was laughing with a group of men I didn't recognize, associates from his firm. I assumed, and he looked, from that distance, like a man who had arrived somewhere. He didn't look over. I didn't expect him to. I drove home on the same road I had driven for 31 years. The porch light was on. I went inside, changed out of the suit, and folded it back into the garment bag. Then I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. I thought about the coffee shop on Burnside, the wooden table, his hands around the cup, the way he had said, "I know, Dad." The tea went cold. I drank it anyway. The next morning, I called Robert Hayes and asked him to schedule a review of the trust structure. I did not tell him why. He scheduled it for the following Tuesday. I went. I wore a dark suit that I had bought for Ellen's funeral and had dry cleaned twice since. It fit correctly. I sat in the third row on the groom's side, between a cousin of David's mother, whom I hadn't seen in 11 years, and an empty seat that no one claimed. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that very expensive ceremonies are everything coordinated, nothing accidental. David looked happy. I want to be precise about that. He looked genuinely happy, not performed happy, and I held on to that because it mattered. Whatever else was happening around him, he was not a man who had been forced into something. During the reception, I sat at a table near the back of the tent and watched. I ate the salmon, which was very good. I drank 1 glass of champagne and then switched to water. Several of Sarah's family members came by the table and introduced themselves with the pleasant efficiency of people who are good at social events. Sarah herself came by once, briefly, to thank me for coming. She said it with warmth that was entirely correct and entirely surface level, and I thanked her and said she looked lovely, which was true. Across the room, David was laughing with a group of men I didn't recognize, associates from his firm. I assumed, or friends of Sarah's family. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly and holding a glass of champagne, and he looked, from that distance, like a man who had arrived somewhere. I watched him for a while. He didn't look over. I didn't expect him to. I drove home on the same road I had driven for 31 years. The porch light was on when I got back. I had left it on before I left that morning. I went inside, changed out of the suit, and folded it back into the garment bag. Then I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and thought about the last time David had come to this house without Sarah being the reason he called first. I thought about the coffee shop on Burnside, the wooden table, his hands around the cup, the way he had said, "I know, Dad." I thought the structure is still in him. It has to be. I built it with 20 years of mornings and dinners and Sunday phone calls and one specific conversation in a converted warehouse with 30-foot ceilings. It does not disappear because someone started asking questions about the jacket. I sat there for a long time. The tea went cold. I drank it anyway. I had managed an $800 million defense budget for 3 years without a single line-item audit finding. I want to be precise about that number because David never knew it. And because it matters to what happened later. Not the amount itself. Money is just a unit of measurement, but what managing that amount required. Attention to every document. Patience with every process. The understanding that the most dangerous mistakes are not the ones made in haste, but the ones made in confidence. I served 28 years in the Marine Corps. I retired as a colonel at 53. Which is neither early nor late. It is the natural terminus of a career built on performance rather than ambition. I do not say that to distinguish myself. I say it because David grew up watching me leave the house at 5:30 in the morning in a uniform, and I think he understood the uniform as the thing itself, rather than as the container for what was inside it. He was 8 years old when Ellen died. Pancreatic cancer moves fast. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. I was stationed at Camp Pendleton at the time, and I drove back to Portland every weekend for those 11 weeks, 14 hours round trip, twice a week when I could arrange it. We talked about what came after, not for us, for him. Ellen said, "Don't let him think money is safety." She said it twice, on 2 different weekends. She had a way of returning to the things that mattered most. I told her I understood. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I know you do." I retired 4 years later when David was 12 and came back to Portland full-time. I kept the house on Gleason Street, a 3-bedroom Craftsman built in 1954 with a furnace that requires annual attention and a back porch that lists slightly toward the east. I drive a 2003 Honda Civic I bought used in 2008. I wear, most days, the same canvas work jacket I bought at a surplus store in 1997. The accounts I kept separate from daily life were not hidden in any illegal sense. A man who spent 28 years managing classified logistics understands the difference between secrecy and discretion. The investment portfolio Robert Hayes helped me structure beginning in 2009 was documented, audited, and entirely legitimate. The real estate holdings, 2 commercial properties in Northwest Portland and a warehouse on the east side, converted to rental units in 2014, were registered in my name, and a family trust that Ellen and I had established in 2001. None of this was invisible. It simply required someone to look. David never looked. I do not blame him for that. I had not given him reason to look, which was intentional. Ellen's instruction had been clear. Let him learn the value of things before he learns their price. What I had not anticipated was Sarah. I set my coffee down and called Robert Hayes that evening, not about Sarah, not yet, but about the trust documents Ellen and I had last reviewed in 2015. I asked him to pull them. He asked why. I told him I wanted to understand what I was working with. He said he'd have them on his desk by Thursday. Pancreatic cancer moves fast. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. I was stationed at Camp Pendleton at the time, and I drove back to Portland every weekend for those 11 weeks, 14 hours round trip, twice a week when I could arrange it, and I sat with her in the back bedroom of the house on Gleason Street while David slept in the next room, and we talked about what came after. Not for us, for him. Ellen was the one who said, "Don't let him think money is safety." She said it twice, on 2 different weekends, which meant she had been thinking about it between visits. She had a way of returning to the things that mattered most. I told her I understood. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I know you do." That was the last serious conversation we had before she stopped being able to talk easily. I retired 4 years later, when David was 12, and I came back to Portland full-time. I could have bought a larger house. The retirement pension and the accumulated investment accounts made that straightforward. Instead, I kept the house on Gleason Street, which is a 3-bedroom craftsman built in 1954 with a furnace that requires annual attention and a back porch that lists slightly toward the east. I drive a 2003 Honda Civic that I bought used in 2008 and have maintained myself since. I wear, most days, the same canvas work jacket I bought at a surplus store in 1997, which has 2 chest pockets and a broken zipper on the left sleeve that I have never had repaired because it does not affect function. David was embarrassed by the jacket for approximately 4 years, from age 14 to 18. He mentioned it 3 times directly and several more times indirectly, usually in the form of suggesting we go shopping. I never went. Not because I was making a point. I genuinely did not think the jacket required replacement, but looking back, I think the jacket was doing work I had not consciously assigned it. The accounts I kept separate from daily life were not hidden in any illegal sense. They were simply not discussed. A man who spent 28 years managing classified logistics understands the difference between secrecy and discretion. The investment portfolio Robert Hayes helped me structure beginning in 2009 was documented, audited, and entirely legitimate. The real estate holdings, 2 commercial properties in Northwest Portland and a warehouse on the east side that I had converted to rental units in 2014 were registered in my name and a family trust that Ellen and I had established in 2001. None of this was invisible. It simply required someone to look. David never looked. I do not blame him for that. I had not given him reason to look, which was intentional. Ellen's instruction had been clear, and I had followed it. Let him learn the value of things before he learns their price. What I had not anticipated was Sarah. She came into David's life during his 2nd year at Lewis and Clark Law School, which would have been 2018. He called to tell me about her in March of that year, on a Sunday evening, which was our established call time. He described her as brilliant and driven, which she was. He described her as understanding, which I reserved judgment on. He brought her to Portland for the first time that July, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table on Gleason Street and looked at the house the way a contractor looks at a building assessing load-bearing capacity, not admiring the architecture. She asked me, at some point during that first dinner, what I had done before retirement. I told her I had been in the Marine Corps. She asked what rank. I told her colonel. She paused, a brief pause, the kind that indicates recalibration rather than surprise, and then she asked what I did after retirement. I told her I managed some properties and consulted occasionally on logistics contracts. Both of these things were true. She said, "So you're comfortable." I said, "I'm fine." She looked at the canvas jacket hanging on the hook by the back door. She looked at the Civic in the driveway, which was visible through the kitchen window. She looked back at me with an expression I recognized from 28 years of reading people across tables in circumstances considerably more consequential than a dinner in Portland. She said, "David talks about you like you're," she paused, "like you're very important to him." I said, "He's important to me." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are deciding what to do with information rather than responding to it. Then she said, "But you're just his dad, right?" I held the question for a moment. There was a version of the answer that was accurate in the way a balance sheet is accurate numbers, properties, accounts, a defense budget that had once required a staff of 14 to track. There was another version that was accurate in the way Ellen had meant it to be accurate: the Sunday calls, the 14-hour drives, the jacket with the broken zipper, the house on Gleason Street where David had learned that a person's worth is not denominated in anything you can deposit. I chose the second version because it was the one that mattered, and because I had learned long ago that the most powerful position is the one your opponent cannot see. I said, "I'm David's father. That's who I am." Sarah smiled. It was a small smile, precise and satisfied, the smile of someone who has just received confirmation of a working hypothesis. I watched her return to her salad. I thought about Ellen. I thought about the back bedroom on Gleason Street and the conversation about what money is not. I thought about David at 8 years old, asleep in the next room, while his mother and I decided what kind of man he would become. I thought, she thinks she has the full picture. I did not correct her. Robert Hayes had been my attorney for 11 years, and in that time I had never seen him look nervous. He wasn't nervous that morning either. He was standing by the window of his office on the 9th floor of the Morrison building when I arrived at 8:27, holding a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching the Willamette catch the early light. He turned when I came in. "You ready?" I set my jacket on the chair by the door. "I've been ready for 8 months." He nodded once, the way men nod when they've been waiting to hear a specific sentence and have finally heard it. He set the coffee down on the windowsill and crossed to his desk, where a manila folder sat closed in the center of the blotter. He opened it and turned it toward me without saying anything. The first page was a still frame from the parking garage camera at the Multnomah County Courthouse, dated 6 weeks ago, time stamped 4:47 p.m. David and Sarah standing beside her car, close together. David's phone was in his hand. The second page was a transcript. I had read it 4 times before that morning, but I read it again. Sarah's voice, rendered in plain type, was remarkably clear. "Tell him it's an insult. Tell him you won't accept it. Do it in front of the room. Do it where it counts." There were 41 pages in the folder. I went through each one. Call logs. A bank transfer record, $18,000 moved from a joint account into a separate account in Sarah's name, 2 days after David had told me he needed no help with legal fees. A second transcript, this one from a dinner at a restaurant on NW 23rd, captured by a device the size of a coat button. I had placed it myself on a Thursday evening in March, while David was in the restroom. I closed the folder. "If he tears the check," I said, "in front of the room, what does the court see?" Hayes picked up his coffee. "Voluntary destruction of a legal instrument during an active inheritance proceeding, combined with the transcripts, the transfer record, and the surveillance documentation, the court sees a coordinated attempt to manipulate the distribution and provoke a breach." He paused. "Judge Chen will see it in about 30 seconds. I took the checkbook from my inside pocket. I wrote the amount, $5 million, even in the same block print I had used for every check I had written since 1987. I tore it along the perforation, held it for a moment, then placed it in a plain white envelope and sealed it. "Make sure the camera has a clear line to the table," I said. Hayes smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile all morning. I buttoned my jacket and picked up my keys. I walked into the Multnomah County Courthouse at 9:15 in the morning. The lobby smelled like floor wax and recycled air. A security officer named Darnell, I had seen him at that entrance 3 times in the past 8 months, nodded when I came through the metal detector. I nodded back. I took the elevator to the 4th floor, turned left at the clerk's window, and walked toward courtroom 4B. David was already there. He was standing in the corridor outside the courtroom doors with Sarah beside him and a younger attorney I didn't recognize on his left. David had his back to me when I came around the corner. Sarah saw me first. She said something to David low, quick, and he turned. He looked at me for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his attorney and continued talking. He didn't extend his hand. He didn't nod. He didn't say my name. I had shaken that boy's hand every morning for the first 11 years of his life. It was something his mother and I had started when he was 4, a morning handshake before school. Firm grip, eye contact, the whole thing. He had thought it was funny at first. By the time he was 7, he had stopped thinking it was funny and started doing it like he meant it. I remembered the morning he got it right for the first time, the pressure even. The wrist straight. His eyes steady on mine. His mother had watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. She had just smiled. That was 24 years ago. I walked past them and set my briefcase on the bench outside the courtroom doors. I checked my watch. 9:16. Sarah spoke first. She said, "You're going to wear that jacket into court." I looked at her. She was in a charcoal suit with a silk blouse, her hair pulled back, a bracelet on her left wrist that I recognized it had been my wife Ellen's, given to David after the funeral to keep in the family. Sarah was wearing it on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse corridor like a prop she had selected carefully the night before. I looked at the jacket I was wearing. It was a navy wool blazer I had owned for 12 years. It had been dry cleaned 4 days ago. There was nothing wrong with it. I said, "We'll begin in 15 minutes. David turned then. He looked at me the way he had started looking at me about 14 months ago, not with anger exactly, but with something that had been shaped to look like contempt. A learned expression. I had watched it develop the way you watch weather change gradually, then all at once. He said, "Did you actually bring documentation, or did you just come down here to waste everyone's time?" I set my briefcase flat on the bench and opened it. I removed the folder Hayes had prepared, tabbed, indexed, organized in the order we had discussed 3 days prior. Beneath the folder was the white envelope. I placed both on top of the briefcase, visible, and left them there. David's eyes went to the envelope. I had sealed it in Hayes' office 40 minutes earlier. Plain white, letter-sized, no markings on the outside. The check inside was written in the same block print I had used since 1987, on the same account I had held at First Interstate since Ellen and I opened it together the year David was born. $5 million. Even. The envelope was not thick. A single check doesn't take up much space, but the way David looked at it told me everything I needed to know about what he expected to find inside. His expression changed, not dramatically, just a small shift around the eyes, the kind that happens when someone recalculates. Sarah had moved closer to him. I watched her lean in, her voice low enough that she intended me not to hear. I heard anyway. 22 years in the Marines teaches you to listen in conditions most people consider quiet. She said, "That's his money. If he were actually honest, he'd hand it over without the contract. The contract means he doesn't trust you. It means he's protecting himself, not you. Think about what that tells you." David didn't answer her right away. He was still looking at the envelope. I picked up the folder and the envelope and put them back in the briefcase. I closed the latch. I looked at my watch again. 9:18. Sarah's logic had a surface that sounded like it made sense. I had heard variations of it for the past year, the idea that requiring documentation was itself an act of bad faith, that a father who trusted his son would simply transfer wealth without conditions. It was a clean argument if you didn't look at it too closely. It assumed that trust and legal structure were opposites. They are not. Every contract I had signed in 30 years of government service had been with people I trusted completely. The documentation wasn't about distrust. It was about clarity. It was about making sure that what I intended and what was received were the same thing. But I had stopped explaining that to David 9 months ago. The younger attorney I learned later his name was Marcus Webb, 2 years out of Lewis, and Clark Law was pretending to review something on his phone. He wasn't reviewing anything. He was listening. I noted the angle of his shoulders, the stillness of his thumb on the screen. David said, "You've prepared every document except the ones that actually matter." I looked at him. He was 31 years old. He had his mother's jaw and my eyes. And right now, both of those things looked wrong on his face, arranged into an expression she would not have recognized, and I did not want to. I said, "Robert Hayes is already inside. We can discuss the documents with him present." David said nothing. Sarah touched his arm, once, and he straightened slightly, a small adjustment, like a posture correction. I had watched her do that to him 4 times in the past 2 months. Each time, he responded the same way. I picked up my briefcase. The corridor had 2 other people in it, a clerk named Yvonne who worked the 4B docket and had been at that courthouse for 16 years, and a man in a gray suit I didn't recognize who appeared to be waiting for a different proceeding. Yvonne had been watching the exchange from the clerk's window. When I glanced at her, she looked down at her desk. I walked to the courtroom doors and pushed them open. The room smelled like old wood and central heating. The gallery had 8 rows of benches. Hayes was already at the plaintiff's table, his second folder open, his pen uncapped. He looked up when I came in, checked the door behind me, and looked back at his notes. I sat down, set my briefcase on the floor beside my chair, and folded my hands on the table. Behind me, I heard the corridor doors open again, David's footsteps, then Sarah's, then the younger attorney's. I did not turn around. The bailiff called the room to order at 9:03. Judge Chen had not yet entered. The overhead lights were the kind that hummed just below the threshold of hearing you felt them more than heard them. I had been in rooms like this before, in different buildings, different cities, different decades. The geometry was always the same. 2 tables facing forward, a raised bench, a flag in the corner, the weight of whatever was about to happen pressing down from the ceiling. David sat at the table to my left. His attorney, Marcus Reeves, according to the card Hayes had shown me 3 weeks earlier, sat beside him, a leather portfolio open, a yellow legal pad with handwriting in green ink. I noticed the green ink. It was the kind of small choice that was meant to signal individuality. I had met men like Marcus Reeves many times. They were competent in the way that a well-maintained tool is competent. They did what they were aimed at. Sarah sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind David. She was wearing a gray blazer and a single strand of pearls. She had arranged herself carefully. Everything about her posture said, "I am not the one on trial here. I am simply a witness to an injustice." David had not looked at me since we entered. He was reading something, or pretending to read something, on the yellow legal pad Marcus had slid in front of him. His right hand was flat on the table. His left hand was in his lap. I knew that posture. I had seen it on young officers who were about to give a briefing they weren't sure they believed. Hayes leaned close and said, very quietly, "Ready?" I told him yes. Judge Chen entered at 9:07. Everyone stood. She took her seat, opened the file in front of her, and read for approximately 45 seconds before she looked up. She had been on the bench for 25 years. It showed in the way she read, not performing attention, but actually paying it. Marcus Reeves stood before the judge called on him. She gave him a look. He sat back down. She called on him 30 seconds later. He said, "Your Honor, we are here today because Mr. James Whitmore has engaged in a pattern of financial concealment and emotional manipulation directed at his son, David Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore has hidden assets, misrepresented the value of the estate, and has used the promise of inheritance as a mechanism of control over his son's personal and professional decisions. We intend to demonstrate that the so-called gift being offered today is not a gift at all. It is a leash." I wrote the word leash on the notepad in front of me. I underlined it once. Marcus continued for 4 more minutes. He used the phrases pattern of behavior, documented instances, and my client's sincere desire for a healthy family relationship, each exactly once, which told me he had rehearsed the opening. David sat with his eyes forward. At one point, he glanced toward me, a quick movement, the kind you make when you want to check a reaction without appearing to check it. I was writing. I did not look up. That was intentional. I have learned, over a long career that required me to sit very still in rooms where a great deal was at stake, that silence reads differently depending on what surrounds it. A man who says nothing because he has nothing to say looks one way. A man who says nothing because he is waiting looks another way entirely. I was not performing calm, but I understood that David was watching me for evidence of something, guilt or anger, or the flinching confirmation that Marcus's words had landed. I gave him none of those things. I wrote notes. I turned a page. I let the clock move. David needed to sit in this room and hear what Marcus was saying and watch his father not collapse under it. He needed to see that the accusations, delivered with confidence and green ink and rehearsed phrasing, did not cause me to reach across the table and defend myself. Because the moment I defended myself, the moment I said that's not true, or you don't understand, I would become the man Marcus was describing. A man rattled by exposure. A man with something to hide. I had nothing to hide. That was the point. I had spent 8 months making sure that everything I was could be laid out on a table and examined. I was not afraid of Marcus Reeves. I was not afraid of the accusations. I was waiting the way you wait when you have already done the work, and the only remaining variable is time. Hayes wrote something on his own notepad and slid it toward me. It said, "He's looking at you again." I wrote back, "I know." I turned to the next page of my notes and kept writing. Sarah Whitmore arrived at 10 o'clock exactly. I heard the door before I saw her, a specific sound, the kind of entrance that is practiced rather than natural, heels measured to land at a particular volume on marble floors. I had been in enough briefing rooms to know the difference between someone walking in and someone making an entrance. She was wearing a cream-colored jacket with black trim. I recognized the interlocking C's on the buttons without knowing the price, though Robert had mentioned a figure once that I had filed away without comment. Her earrings were gold, small, and real. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortless and was not. She carried a leather portfolio that she did not open. It was a prop. I had seen officers carry props into command briefings folders that contained nothing, tablets that weren't turned on. The prop communicated preparation. It communicated that you had done work no one else had done. She did not look at me when she came in. That was the first thing I noticed. A person who genuinely feels nothing toward you looks through you. A person who has made a decision about you looks away deliberately. Sarah looked away deliberately. She moved to the row directly behind David and settled into the seat with the particular composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment and found it satisfying. David turned when he felt her presence. Something in his posture changed, a slight forward lean, a loosening across the shoulders. I had seen it before, in the months since he'd married her. He was a different man when she was in the room. Not better or worse, exactly. Recalibrated. As if the version of himself that existed without her was a rough draft and she was the final edit. She placed her hand on his shoulder. Her nails were short and lacquered the color of old bone. She leaned forward and said something close to his ear. I could not hear the words from where I sat, but I had spent 26 years reading conversations I wasn't part of in mess halls, in forward operating bases, in rooms where the stakes were considerably higher than this one. I read the shape of what she said from the angle of her jaw, the pace of her lips, the way David's chin lifted slightly when she finished. He has no defense. I didn't need to hear it. I knew the sentence before she said it. Hayes was writing something to my left. I kept my eyes forward. David straightened in his seat. He looked at the white envelope on the table in front of me, the one I had set there at 9:47, centered, parallel to the table's edge. He had glanced at it twice before Sarah arrived. Now he looked at it differently. The quality of his attention had changed. Before, it was the look of a man calculating. Now it was the look of a man who had been given permission. Sarah leaned in again. This time I caught 3 words in the gap between her lips and his ear. Tear it up. The room had its own rhythm, Marcus Reeves at the far table, arranging his second set of documents. The court reporter, a woman named Donna Espinoza, who had been in this courtroom for 14 years, adjusting the paper roll on her machine with the practiced patience of someone who had heard everything twice. The two associates from David's firm seated behind Marcus, neither of them looking at anything in particular, all of them present, all of them witnesses, whether they knew it or not. David said something back to Sarah. She smiled. It was a small smile, contained, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes because it isn't meant to. It was a smile of confirmation, not warmth. She had told him what to do, and he had agreed, and the smile was the closing of that transaction. I picked up my pen and made a note on the third page of my legal pad. The note was 2 words. I did not underline them. Hayes glanced at what I'd written and nodded once without looking up from his own papers. David turned back toward the front of the room. He was sitting very straight now. His jaw was set. I recognized the posture I had worn it myself 30 years ago, in situations that required a man to look certain before he felt certain. The difference was that I had learned, eventually, that the posture was a preparation, not a substitute. David had not learned that yet. I set down my pen. I folded my hands on top of the legal pad and looked at the clock on the wall above the bench. It read 10:08. Judge Chen had not yet entered. We had perhaps 4 minutes. I did not look at Sarah again. There was nothing useful in looking at her. I had already seen what I needed to see, and the rest was already in motion, had been in motion for 8 months, through 3 amended filings, 2 depositions, and 1 conversation with Robert Hayes on a Tuesday evening in his office when he had laid out the sequence, and I had said, "Let's make sure the sequence is airtight." It was airtight. I was certain of that the way I was certain of things I had personally verified. The door to the judge's chambers opened. Everyone in the room stood. The clerk said, "All rise for the Honorable Patricia Chen, Judge of the Multnomah County Circuit Court." The sound of chairs scraping back was uniform, automatic. I stood with the rest of them. David stood 2 rows ahead of me, his posture correct, his suit jacket buttoned. He had learned that much, at least how to stand in a courtroom. I had taught him that when he was 9 years old, the summer I took him to watch a military tribunal proceeding at Camp Pendleton. He had worn a clip-on tie and asked questions the entire drive home. That was a different David. I did not spend time thinking about when exactly the change had happened. I had spent enough time on that already. Judge Chen took the bench without ceremony. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and the particular stillness of someone who had presided over enough human wreckage that very little surprised her anymore. I had read her record before this proceeding, 25 years on the bench, 17 in family and estate matters. She had seen everything. I was counting on that. She arranged her documents, looked at the room over the rim of her glasses, and said, "We're here this morning to finalize the inheritance contract in the matter of Whitmore. Both parties are present. Counsel is present." She looked at her notes, then at David. "Mr. Whitmore, before we proceed, do you have any questions about the terms as filed?" The room was quiet. I watched David's shoulders. He stood up. He was holding a white envelope. I had given it to him 40 minutes earlier in the hallway outside Hayes's office, the sealed envelope containing the cashier's check drawn on the Whitmore family trust account. $5,000 made out to David Allen Whitmore as partial disbursement of the estate. Hayes had prepared it. I had signed the authorization. Everything about it was legitimate. Everything about it was documented. David held the envelope at his side. He looked at the judge, and then he looked at me, and his voice came out louder than the room required. "I have a question," he said. "Why did he hide his money? Why did he lie to me about what he had—" The room shifted. I heard someone I thought it was the young associate from Marcus Hale's firm, a woman named Priya Nair, who had been taking notes in the second row, set her pen down on the table. I stood up. I kept my voice level. "I never lied to you. I wanted to teach you about something that mattered more than the amount." David's mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile. "Honor," he said. "Right. Honor." He said the word the way you say a word you've decided is meaningless. You don't have honor. You have money and you have lies. That's all you've ever had." I did not answer. There was nothing useful in answering. He tore it up. He pulled the envelope open, took out the check, held it at chest height with both hands, and tore it in half. Then he tore it again. The pieces fell. They came down slowly, the way paper does when the air in a room has gone perfectly still, and they landed on the floor of the Multnomah County Circuit Court in front of 20 people, Judge Chen, 4 attorneys including Hayes and Hale, the court reporter whose name was Deborah Sachs and who had stopped typing, 3 clerks, 2 bailiffs, and the 7 gallery observers who had come for various proceedings and found themselves watching something else entirely. No one spoke. Sarah stood up. She began to clap. Single, deliberate claps, her hands coming together slowly, her eyes on me. She said, "Now you're free, David. Now it's done." David looked at me. I understood what he was waiting for. He wanted to see something on my face, grief, or rage, or the particular collapse of a man who has just watched something he valued be destroyed in public. He had prepared for those responses. Sarah had prepared him for those responses. I could see it in the way he was watching me, the slight forward lean, the held breath. I looked at the pieces of paper on the floor. Then I looked at my son. My eyes had gone cold, not from anger, I want to be precise about this, not from grief. There is a specific quality of stillness that 26 years of military command teaches you, a place you go when the situation has moved past the point where emotion serves any tactical purpose. I had been in that place before, in circumstances that had nothing to do with courtrooms or inheritance. I went there now. David's expression changed. He had expected something. He had not expected this. I sat down. The room had the particular silence of people who don't know what to do with their hands. I heard someone behind me shift in a chair. I heard the ventilation system in the ceiling. I counted the acoustic tiles above the bench, 22 of them, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind that absorb sound and give nothing back. David was still standing. The pieces of the check were on the floor between us, 5 of them. I had counted, and his hand was still slightly open, the way a hand stays after it releases something. Sarah sat in the row directly behind him, and she had arranged her expression into something that was meant to look like calm. It didn't. I know the difference between calm and performance. I have spent most of my adult life around people who were very good at that performance, and I have learned to read the small failures in it. The way her left thumb was pressing against the side of her index finger, the way her eyes moved to the door once, then corrected. I looked at Robert Hayes. That was all. I did not speak. I did not nod dramatically or stand or do anything that the room might interpret as a signal. I simply looked at him. And Robert Hayes, who had been my attorney for 11 years, and who had sat across from me in his office on the 2nd floor of a building on SW 5th Avenue for more than 40 separate meetings over the past 8 months, stood up. He said, "Your Honor, we have evidence we'd like to present." Judge Patricia Chen had been on the bench for 25 years. I had researched her before we filed in this court. She had a reputation for patience and for what one former colleague had described to me as a complete absence of theatrics. She did not lean forward. She did not raise an eyebrow. She said, "Proceed, Mr. Hayes." Robert set a tablet on the edge of the clerk's table. He turned it so it faced the bench. He said, "Your Honor, I'm going to ask you to watch approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds of footage. The timestamp and source metadata are included in the exhibit packet your clerk received this morning." David's attorney, a man named Marcus Ellison, whom I had met once before today, and whose firm was listed as Ellison and Brandt on the placard by the door, said, "Objection, we haven't reviewed this material." Judge Chen said, "Noted. I'll review it before ruling on admissibility." She looked at the tablet. "Mr. Hayes, proceed." The video began. The angle was high and slightly left of center, the kind of positioning you get from a smoke detector housing, which is where the device had been placed. The room in the footage was a living room. I recognized the sectional sofa in a gray-green fabric, the coffee table with the glass top, the framed print on the wall that I had always found cold. David and Sarah's house on Burnside. The timestamp in the lower right corner read 2 days ago, 7:43 in the evening. David was sitting on the sofa. Sarah was standing near the window with a glass of wine. The audio was clear. The device Robert had used was rated for rooms up to 800 square feet, and that living room was considerably smaller. Sarah's voice came through the tablet speaker and filled the courtroom. "If you tear that check, the court will treat it as a breach of contract on his part. He'll lose everything, and we'll have the money." David's voice quieter, "But won't there be consequences?" "Sarah, not if we say he deceived you, say he misrepresented the terms. The court will believe you over him. You're his son. You're a lawyer. He's an old man with a pension." The room around me did not move. I did not look at David during the playback. I looked at the tablet. David's voice again, a pause before it. "You're sure about this?" "Sarah, I've already talked to Marcus. He thinks it's clean. Just do it the way we discussed. Don't hesitate. Do it in front of people. The more witnesses, the better it makes it look like a genuine response to something he did." The footage ended. The timestamp read 7:47. Robert set the tablet down. He said, "Your Honor, we also have documentation of 47 recorded calls between David Whitmore and Sarah Whitmore over the preceding 6 weeks, in which the strategy you just witnessed being discussed was refined. The call logs, transcripts, and audio excerpts are in the exhibit packet as Exhibits C through F." He paused. "Additionally, we have bank records showing that 3 days ago, Sarah Whitmore transferred $200,000 from the joint account she holds with David Whitmore into a personal account in her name alone. The transfer occurred at 11:14 in the morning. The account number and routing information are in Exhibit G." Marcus Ellison stood up. He was a man of about 45, well-dressed, with the particular posture of someone who has argued in front of judges long enough to know how to manage his own body language. That posture was not working for him at this moment. He said, "Your Honor, I need to—" He stopped. He looked at David. Then he looked at the tablet. Then he picked up his briefcase from beside his chair, and he said, "Your Honor, I need to withdraw from this proceeding. I was not informed of the matters just presented, and I cannot continue as counsel without reviewing them." He looked at Judge Chen directly. "I apologize for the disruption." Judge Chen said, "Withdrawal noted. Mr. Ellison, you may go." He went. He walked past David without looking at him. He walked past the gallery row where Sarah was sitting without looking at her either. The door opened and closed, and the sound of it was very clear in the room. David had not moved since the video ended. He was still standing in front of the plaintiff's table, and he was looking at Sarah, not at me. At Sarah. She had turned her face toward the window on the far wall. There was no view through it. It was a frosted interior window, the kind that exists only to give the impression of natural light. She was looking at it anyway. David said her name once, quietly. She did not respond. I watched him understand something. It took about 4 seconds. I've seen men understand things in the field the moment a situation rearranges itself in someone's mind, when the version of events they were operating inside of collapses and is replaced by the actual version. It is not a dramatic thing to witness. It is quiet, and it is complete, and it leaves a particular expression that I have never been able to describe precisely. David had that expression now. Judge Chen looked at David. She said, "Mr. Whitmore, do you wish to make a statement?" David said nothing. His hands were at his sides. The pieces of the check were still on the floor between us. Judge Chen looked at me. Then, it was a brief look, professional, contained, but there was something in it, the particular quality that belongs to someone who has seen the inside of courtrooms for a quarter century and has developed, over that time, a very accurate internal register for the difference between someone who was wronged and someone who came prepared to prove it. She looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not a smile in the way that word is usually meant. It was smaller than that, and colder, and it lasted less than a second, and what it communicated was not warmth, but recognition, the recognition of someone who has just watched a plan execute exactly as designed. I had waited 8 months for that look. I did not react to it. I simply held her gaze for the one additional second that was appropriate, and then I looked forward again. Robert was speaking. He said, "Your Honor, given the evidence presented, we're asking the court to formally enter the destroyed instrument into the record as Exhibit A, which it already is, having been torn in this courtroom in front of 20 witnesses, and to treat the act as the breach of the settlement agreement dated 8 months prior, as outlined in Section 4, Paragraph 2 of that agreement, which specifies that any deliberate destruction of a disbursement instrument constitutes voluntary forfeiture of the associated claim." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. David Whitmore destroyed the check himself, in this room, in front of you, Your Honor, and in front of every person currently present. We did not need to prove intent. He demonstrated it." David turned toward me for the first time since the video had played. His face had the look of a man who has just counted the distance between where he is standing and the exit and found that it is too far. He said, "Dad." I did not answer right away. I have found, over many years, that silence in these moments causes people to say things they would not otherwise say. The silence serves a purpose. I let it do its work. He said, I didn't. Sarah told me." He stopped. He looked at the floor. Then he looked at Sarah again, and she was still looking at the frosted window, and her thumb was still pressing against the side of her index finger. Harder now. I said, "I know." 2 words, that was all I offered him. Not because I had nothing else to say, because everything else had already been said in the exhibit packets, in the 47 calls, in the footage from the living room on Burnside, in the bank transfer at 11:14 in the morning 3 days ago. I had been saying it for 8 months without speaking a word of it aloud, and now it was in the record, and the record did not require my elaboration. Judge Chen made a note on the pad in front of her. She looked up. She said, "I'm going to review the exhibit packet in full before issuing rulings, but I want the parties to understand that what has occurred in this courtroom today, the deliberate destruction of a legal instrument in open session, is not something I will be setting aside." She looked at David. "You will need to retain new counsel before the next scheduled date. I'd suggest doing so today." She looked at Sarah's Rao. "Ms. Whitmore, you are not a party to this proceeding, but the evidence entered today is now part of the public record. I'd suggest you consult an attorney as well." Sarah said nothing. She was very still. A woman in the second row of the gallery, her name was Renata Flores, a paralegal from Abernathy and Cross who used Courtroom 7 3 or 4 times a month. I had seen her at 2 prior hearings, and Robert had mentioned her name once in passing, set her pen down on her legal pad, and looked at the bench for a long moment. Then she leaned over to the man beside her, a young associate I didn't recognize, and said, quietly, but not quietly enough, she just referred it to the police bureau. In open session. The associate looked at Sarah's Rao. Renata Flores did not. She picked her pen back up and wrote something at the top of her page, underlined it once, and did not look up again. He nodded. Neither of them looked away from the bench. The pieces of the check were still on the floor. I did not pick them up. They were Exhibit A. They belonged to the record now, and the record was exactly where I had always intended them to go. I had written that check with a specific pen, a Pilot G2 in blue ink, the same pen I had used to sign every significant document for the past 19 years. I had written it in this building, at the clerk's window on the second floor, in front of Robert Hayes and a notary named Ellen Marsh, who had been in that office for 16 years. Ellen had initialed the margin. Her initials were on the exhibit copy. I had handed that check to my son, knowing exactly what he would do with it. Sarah had told him to do it in front of witnesses. She had said the more witnesses, the better. She had been correct about that, though not in the way she intended. I looked at my hands. They were steady. They had been steady all morning. Robert was gathering his folders. He aligned them along their bottom edge against the table, a habit I had noticed in our first meeting, 11 years ago, and every meeting since. The room was beginning to move again. The small adjustments of people who are reassembling their understanding of what they have just witnessed. David was still standing. He had not moved toward the door, and he had not moved toward me, and he had not moved toward Sarah, who had finally looked away from the frosted window and was now looking at the floor in front of her feet. He was standing in the space between all three of those directions, and he looked very young. He was 28 years old. I had taught him to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the house on Xavier Street when he was 6. I had attended every one of his wrestling matches in high school, sitting in the third row of the bleachers, because that was the row where the acoustics allowed you to hear the coach's corner instructions without straining. I had paid for 3 years of law school and said nothing about it except that I expected him to use the degree with integrity. I did not think about any of this with sentiment. I simply noted it. The way you note the distance to a landmark when you are navigating. It was information. It was context. It was not a reason to have done anything differently. Judge Chen gathered her papers and rose. The clerk said, "All rise," and we rose. She walked through the door behind the bench, and the door closed, and she was gone. I sat back down. The room took a moment to remember how to breathe. I have been in enough rooms after verdicts to know that particular pause, the 2 or 3 seconds when no one moves and no one speaks, and the only sound is the ventilation system doing its job regardless of what has just happened. This room was no different. 21 people. And for those few seconds, none of them made a sound. David was the first to move. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him, the way a man does when he needs to confirm that a surface is still solid. Marcus Holloway, his attorney, had already begun gathering his files with the careful efficiency of a man who wants to appear occupied rather than implicated. He did not look at David. He did not look at me. He looked at his files, and he stacked them, and he clicked his pen closed twice. Sarah stood up. She pushed back her chair and took 2 steps toward the center aisle, and the court officer, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pruitt, who had been standing near the side door for the entire proceeding, moved to intercept her without any urgency at all. He simply stepped into her path and said, "Ma'am, the judge has not dismissed the parties." He said it the way you say something that has been said many times before. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the door. She looked back at Gerald Pruitt, and Gerald Pruitt did not move. She returned to her seat. Robert stood at the plaintiff's table and waited. He had been waiting for 8 months for this particular moment, and he was not going to rush it now. Judge Chen returned to the bench at 11:47. I know the time because the clock on the east wall had a second hand, and I had been watching it. She settled her papers and looked at the room over the rim of her reading glasses. She had the expression of a woman who has seen every version of this story and is not surprised by any of them, but who takes the work seriously regardless. She said, "Based on the evidence submitted to this court, including the security footage from the Multnomah County Courthouse lobby, the recorded audio from the conference room of Hayes and Associates, the documentary record of the inheritance agreement dated 14 months ago, and the testimony provided under oath this morning, I find that David Whitmore has materially breached the terms of the inheritance contract executed between himself and James Whitmore." She paused and looked directly at David. The act of destroying the instrument, the check in a public setting, before witnesses, while making statements of explicit repudiation, constitutes evidence of fraudulent intent under Oregon statute. It is not ambiguous. It is not subject to interpretation. It is on video. She set down the first page of her ruling and picked up the second. David Whitmore is therefore disqualified from receiving any portion of the estate of James Whitmore under the terms of that agreement. The full estate reverts to the trustee as specified in the original document. This ruling is effective immediately. David's hands were still flat on the table. Judge Chen continued, "Additionally, the court finds sufficient cause in the evidence presented, specifically the recorded communications between Sarah Whitmore and Marcus Holloway, and the financial records subpoenaed from First Pacific Bank to refer this matter to the Portland Police Bureau for investigation of fraud and conspiracy to defraud. Those referral documents will be transmitted this afternoon." She looked up from the page. "Ms. Whitmore, you should retain counsel." She said it without emphasis, as though she were recommending a good restaurant. Sarah did not stand up this time. She sat very still, and I noticed that the color had left her face in a particular way, not flushed, not pale with embarrassment, but pale the way a person goes pale when they realize that the structure they have been building for months has just been disassembled in 4 minutes by a woman with reading glasses and 19 years of patience. Marcus Holloway finished stacking his files. He stood, nodded once in David's direction without meeting his eyes, and walked out of the courtroom. The door closed behind him with a sound that was not dramatic, just a door closing. I watched David watch him go. David turned and looked at me. He had aged in the last 20 minutes in the way that certain people do when a story they have been telling themselves about who they are, about what they deserve, about which direction the world is arranged, stops being available to them. He looked like my son again. That was the hardest part of the morning, and I had known it would be. He said, "Dad." He stopped. He said, "I'm sorry." I looked at him for a moment. There was nothing to say that the morning had not already said more clearly than I could. I had spent 8 months preparing this, and I had spent 28 years before that raising him, and I had spent 3 years before that watching his mother teach him what integrity looked like before she no longer could. The apology was real. I believed that. It was also insufficient, and it was also too late, and both of those things were true at the same time without contradiction. I picked up my briefcase. I buttoned my jacket, the charcoal one, the one I had worn to Margaret's Christmas dinner 11 years ago when she told me I smelled like motor oil, the one I had kept and worn to every formal proceeding since, because I keep things that still function regardless of what someone else said about them. I nodded once to Robert, who nodded back and began speaking quietly to the clerk about the transfer documents. I walked to the end of the row, past the gallery, past the court officer, Gerald Pruitt, who held the door without being asked. I did not look back. The hallway outside courtroom 7 smelled like floor wax and recycled air, the same as every courthouse hallway I have walked in 30 years of dealing with contractors and estate attorneys and the occasional federal compliance officer. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. A young woman in a blue blazer stood beside me with a stack of folders. She did not know who I was or what had just happened 30 feet away. The elevator arrived. We both got in. She pressed 2. I pressed the lobby. I drove home on Route 30 along the river, which is the longer way, but the one I have taken since Ellen and I used to drive it on Sunday mornings before David was born. The Columbia was flat and gray under the November sky, and there were 2 barges moving west at a distance. I drove at the speed limit. I did not think about David's face when Marcus left. I did not think about Sarah's color draining or the sound of the courtroom door. I thought about Ellen about the last year, when she knew she was running out of time, and the things she said to David in that back bedroom while I sat in the hallway and gave them the privacy that moment required. She had told him, in words I was not meant to hear, but did, that the measure of a man is not what he takes, but what he protects. She had said it quietly, the way she said most things that mattered. I had written it down afterward, not because I needed to remember it, but because it deserved to be written. I wondered if he remembered. The house was quiet when I got home. I changed out of the charcoal jacket and hung it in the closet. I made coffee the same brand, the same ratio, the same white cup with the chip on the handle that I have used every morning for 6 years because it holds the right amount and the chip does not affect function. I carried it out to the back porch and sat down in the wooden chair that faces east. The sun had cleared the tree line. It was the particular light of a November morning in Portland, thin and honest, without the softness of summer. It lit the backyard the way a fact lights a room not warmly, but completely. The neighbor's maple had dropped most of its leaves, and they were gathered in the corner of the fence where the wind always pushed them. I had raked that corner 12 times in the last 6 years. I would rake it again. I drank my coffee. I did not feel victorious. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was the specific quiet that comes when a long task is completed, not joy, not relief, but the absence of the particular weight that had been sitting across my shoulders for 8 months. The kind of quiet that a Marine learns to recognize after a long operation, not peace as an emotion, but peace as a condition. The work is done. The position is secure. stand down. I thought about David once more before I let it go, not with anger and not with grief, though both had been present at various points in the last 14 months. I thought about him the way you think about a calculation you have checked twice and confirmed the numbers are what they are. He had made his choices in front of 20 people and a security camera, and the choices had made their own consequences, and I had simply ensured that the consequences had somewhere to land. That was all I had done. That was enough. The coffee cooled. I drank it anyway. A crow landed on the fence post at the far end of the yard, looked at me once, and flew off west toward the river. I watched it until it was gone. Then I set down the cup, folded my hands in my lap, and sat in the November light for a long time without moving. There was nothing left to say. There never is, when the work is done right. If you've ever sat in a yard that took years to earn back not the land itself, but the right to sit in it quietly, without bracing for the next blow, you already understand everything that happened in that courtroom. The silence at the end isn't emptiness. It's what's left when the weight finally lifts and nothing rushes in to replace it. These are the stories I keep,